Okay, so as I mentioned, this is similar content with a few updates, obviously, because the research continues to change in the area of sports nutrition. And our focus today is purely on protein supplementation. So our goal today during the session is to have a conversation on the things we should think about when it comes to supplementing with, proteins. So we start talking about, timing, how much, what type of protein. So we're going to have a conversation on that. So we're going to cover the three fundamental pillars of sports nutrition, which are, protein quality, protein quantity, and protein timing. And then when talking about timing, we're going to really dig into what should we do before exercise, what can we do during exercise, and what should follow after exercise. Now, take this to heart. What I'm sharing with you today, if we were to have this conversation 2 years from today, the science might have changed. We've seen even recommendations on guidelines are changing. So the important thing is to always stay current with your understanding of this content, because obviously I'm imagining many of you take protein supplements for yourselves, for your own benefit, but you're also probably asked by a lot of people, because the moment that they know you're an exercise science person, then they are probably going to be very quick to say, well, should I take it? Should I not take it? And so we have to kind of be educated on this stuff. Remember, we're not necessarily experts in it, but we should have enough understanding of making good suggestions against, all the misinformation that's out there. So let's kind of jump into this. And so just to understand a little bit of what's happening in your body, all right? Recognize that, you go through stages in life. So till you get to your late 20s, early 30s, which is the beginning of the kind of fourth decade of your life, you're spending most of your time in what we call an anabolic state, where you're kind of building more muscle mass than you are technically losing. Now, that's just a generic model, right? I mean, people do all sorts of crazy things, so this can change at any point of time. And then once we kind of get into our early 30s, we start to kind of experience this kind of gradual decline. It's a small decline, but it can be accelerated based on, again, lifestyle choices, where that acceleration could be as much as 0.8% per year, right? Now, the downside of that is accumulated over lifespan, that could be pretty significant. And there's some estimates that for a woman from her, let's call it age 30 to about age 70, it's quite possible that she could lose up to 23% of her muscle mass. For a male, it's a little less, right? But think about what that means to you. I mean, that could be, apart from having a metabolic impact where it's going to change your metabolism significantly, it's also going to have an impact on your functionality, because we lose mass in the lower extremity faster than we do the upper extremity. That means you're going to get weaker in the lower extremity at a rate that outpaces the upper extremity. And if you get significantly weak in the lower extremity, one of the biggest challenges you have is that you might not be able to perform some of those activities, bending down to pick things up, but more importantly, even getting out of a chair or sitting on the toilet, right? You can get to that state if it's left unchecked for years and years and years. So there's this gradual, if you look at it, we spend our lives kind of building, and then we kind of do this decline. But at the same time, we can slow down that rate of decline. And there's no reason to doubt for a moment that you couldn't have more muscle mass when you are 50 than when you had when you're 30. Absolutely could happen. It just depends on lifestyle choices. But this is just a standard model I'm explaining to you. But another thing to also appreciate is this idea of how does protein metabolism happen through the day? In other words, what's going on through your body? Well, it is significantly influenced by two things. Your eating, and when we talk about eating, we've got to talk about how often you're eating and what you're eating, and your activity. So we know that exercise in itself, the bout of exercise, is a catabolic event, right? Excuse me while I just make a little adjustment here to my lights. So exercise in itself is a little bit of a catabolic event, right? If you were to look at your muscle status before a workout and your muscle status at the end of the workout, you've obviously experienced a little bit of muscle breakdown, right? But that's okay, because you're also providing a stimulus that what we hope is in the post-exercise window, that there's an adaptation that follows, where we would say started here, but we overloaded muscle and we ended up with a higher status of the muscle, if you want to call it that. That's what we're always hoping for. That's why we keep lifting, and that's why we keep progressing our programs. So that's pretty much a given. But let's take exercise out of this. What does your day look like outside of exercise? Well, interesting, what we found out is that your day is made up of a series of undulations that you actually go through, and it's happening right now in your body, periods of where you are undergoing what we call muscle protein synthesis, where you are physically building. So let's call that anabolic. And then you're also experiencing what we call muscle protein degradation, which is a little bit of muscle breakdown. We'll call that catabolic. And your day just fluctuates all day long. So what triggers the muscle protein synthesis windows? Eating, and more particular, eating good quality sources of protein. In other words, a minimal threshold of protein and a certain quality of protein. And these undulations happen frequently. What we've now found is that you generally have to eat 4 times, well, not 4 times, you have to eat protein 4 times through your day to kind of at least maintain some sort of semblance of starting and ending in the same place. So think of those people that like to do these 16-8 fasts. They're like, oh, I'm going to eat from 12 to 8, and then I'm going to fast all the way through to 12, and then they're going to work out in the morning too because they want to do faster cardio. You know, these are all anecdotally, they might say, why do you do this? Well, you know, I've heard it's good for building muscle mass. It's good for this. It's good for that. It's good for this. Well, unfortunately, I hate to tell you this. There's no research supporting that. It's all anecdotal. The research actually supports that 4 feedings through the day is generally what we should be looking at. When I say 4 feedings of protein through the day. So after you eat, there is an influx of amino acids into your blood. And because you're eating, there's also an elevation of insulin. So we use the words hyperaminoacidemia and hyperinsulinemia. All right, so hyperaminoacidemia and hyperinsulinemia are both situations where are going to trigger uptake of amino acids into the cells. And one thing we know about insulin, as much as you might think insulin's good, it's bad, we have mixed reactions to it. What it does when it comes to protein is that it actually inhibits the pathways of muscle protein degradation. So anytime you have insulin in circulation, a good outlook or a good outcome of that insulin presence is that for a period of time, it's going to shut down any opportunity for muscle protein breakdown. And that's a good thing. But what's going to happen is over time, so you eat, and maybe now we've gone 3-4 hours post eating, all those amino acids are being gobbled up. They're in the cells. The insulin levels are returned back to normal, which means now you're going to undulate back down to muscle protein degradation. And so your day is going to be made up of a series of undulations. Now, worst case scenario, you don't want to end up lower than where you started because that represents muscle atrophy. And if you had that every day, you are muscle wasting. So what causes that? Well, simple things. You just don't eat. You're not eating frequently enough. You're not eating enough calories. You're not getting enough protein in your diet, right? These are the things that can all lead to that gradual downward trend. Aging is another one. As we age, so once we hit that early 30s, there's a process of that, you know, sliding downwards. So what we want to do is to kind of play the other way if we could. We would like to see our day, or if we had to take the aggregate of days, starting here and ending up a little higher. So that's why we work out and we use strategic protein feedings and we eat enough calories and we do all the right things. We get our rest, we get our recovery. Those things can all create the perfect environment for us taking that trend upwards. It'll undulate, but it's undulating upwards. That's what we want, right? So, sorry, let me turn that off. Sorry about that. It's my phone. Now, we're going to be talking about how much protein do we need, all right? That's a kind of a question that's often asked. But before we get into that, I want to just kind of take a little bit of a kind of a sidebar here and talk about this concept of protein powders and this idea of, are they a food or are they a supplement? So by government definition, they're called a supplement. Now, if you think about it, when many of you graduate, those of you that aren't going to have a license as a dietitian, there's a thing called scope of practice, and we're supposed to respect scope of practice, which means you only practice within your level of or area of expertise. And unfortunately, for a lot of pre-DPTs and athletic trainers and strength and conditioning coaches and personal trainers and people of that nature, we're not dietitians. So the law looks at us as not being experts in that area, even though you might have, you know, tons of classes and tons of knowledge under your belt. So you making a recommendation on supplementation could become a problem. Why? Because foods and drugs are regulated by the FDA, hence the word Food and Drug Administration. Supplements kind of fall into this kind of no man's land where they're loosely governed by the FDA. So the FDA has some oversight of them. Like, for example, if something's potentially dangerous, the FDA can publicly announce that stay away from the supplement. but they can't ban it until they have enough evidence to prove that that supplement is bad. Well, if you go back to the history of protein powders, as we're going to talk about, are essentially made the same way milk and cheese is made. So if you think of it that way, you'd say, well, isn't it a food? Yeah. If you think of its manufacturing process, it qualifies as a food. But unfortunately, many years ago, when protein powders came onto the market to enhance muscle development, everyone said, well, it's an ergogenic aid, which is going to improve performance, so therefore it must be a supplement. So the government just quickly labeled it under that. Now, there's been a lot of arguments as to whether it should remain under that, but as we know it today, it remains as a supplement. So if you think about the scope of practice, we're not supposed to be making recommendations on supplements. So if someone came to you and said, hey, I'm thinking about taking a protein powder, how much should I take and what should I take? And is this product better than that product? You're supposed to just provide them with education and make sure that you don't tell them that's better than that, and I recommend you take that one. It's a little bit of a slippery slope, which kind of sucks, because the reality is you probably know more than some dietitians, because no offense to dietitians, but their area of expertise is really in clinical nutrition and community nutrition. They don't get as much coursework in sports nutrition, right? But unfortunately, it's just the interpretation of the law. So what's been proposed, and it's one way I look at it, is that maybe protein powders are not necessarily a supplement, but they're a complement. So let me explain this concept to you. So first of all, let me talk about how protein powders are made. Most of the protein powder that many of you are consuming is a byproduct of the cheese making process. So we take milk, and if you remember what happens to milk when it spoils, we get the separation of the curd and the whey. Whey is just soluble protein, curd is insoluble protein, because what happens is when milk sours, we call it souring because it's becoming more acidic because of the bacteria in the milk feeding on the sugar, and they're releasing acidic byproducts, and that changes the pH, and that denatures some of the insoluble proteins, what we call the curd, which is also known as casein. Casein is just a placeholder name for insoluble proteins. And that milk curdles. Guess what happens when you drink milk? Same thing happens in your stomach that you'll see with milk. It sits on the counter. It curdles because what do you have in your stomach? Acids. So milk curdles in your stomach and it forms these curds, right? These gels, they call them, or these clumps. So when we're making cheese, we need milk to actually do that. We need to separate the curd from the whey, right? And then we use that curd to make cheese. Well, that's how protein powders are, because we take that whey, or we can even take some of that casein, and from there we just end up converting it to a protein powder. So how do we convert it to a protein powder? Real simple. First of all, you take that whey, which is soluble protein, just dry it, let it evaporate, let the water evaporate. Now you've got a whey powder. And it's used as a food filler. It's in common foods that you find. You might find it in, certain products, baking powders. You might find it in even some of the, they might put a little bits of it into like sugar substitutes just to kind of give it a bit of a filling sensation, not much, but it's all over the place. Now, before it dries, what they can also do is push it through microscopic filters. We call it microfiltration or ultrafiltration. Think about how you decide when you go to the store, I'm not going to buy whole milk, I'm going to buy skim milk, I'm going to buy 1% milk. What are they doing? How do they do that? They simply push this milk stream through these microscopic filters, and it traps the big fat molecules. We're doing the same thing. We're taking a whey stream and we push it through the filters and we get a whey concentrate. What does whey concentrate mean? It's just got a little bit more protein, right? And then we can push it even further through even more microscopic filters, and we call it ultrafiltration, and we can get what? Even further removal of things we don't want, like sugar and ash and minerals and fat, and we get a highly concentrated protein powder. Some of you may be familiar, there's a type of milk on the market right now manufactured by a dairy called Fairlife. And this is called basically ultra-filtered milk. It's supposed to be one of the healthiest milks out there. Why? They've done the same thing. They push it through these specialized filters, and they're also using a little bit of electrolysis like we do with protein powders to remove things. And when you look at a traditional glass of milk that has 8 grams of 8 grams of sugar and 12 grams of sugar and 8 grams of protein, this Fairlife gives you 13 grams of protein and only about 6 grams of sugar. It's a high protein, low sugar milk. They haven't added or changed anything. They just passed the milk through these specialized filters. So that's all part of the food making process, because milk is a food. That's essentially how we're making protein powders. Now, there's one company that has a unique way. They go straight from milk to whey powder, and we'll talk about that. It's called Native Whey, but essentially they're all doing the same thing. right? So given that, it brings up this question, then why is it called a supplement? Well, I've explained that. I've explained a little bit of history to you. So we can sometimes, people say, well, maybe it's a complement, because the reality is protein powders are a very good source of protein, but eating is more than just providing nutrients to your body. There's a lot of social, emotional, behaviors involved with eating. So the word complement means to facilitate or to be a partner with. And so let's look at this table that you see right there. So I'm just using a number. Let's say you had a goal of 140 grams in a day of protein, and you decided I wanted it all through Whole Foods. Well, I've given you a menu of foods. This doesn't represent all the calories, because you notice there's no good stuff in there. When I say good stuff, there's no alcohol, there's no chocolate, there's no good stuff. I mean, we've got Halloween around the corner, right? There's none of that stuff in there. But you can see, in order to get to my 140 grams, it's about 2,000 calories worth of energy. Now flip on the other side, to the other side of the table. What if I decided to complement my Whole Foods with some protein powder? So I'm going after roughly just around 60 grams from a good protein powder. And now I'm looking at the calories. Look at the calorie differential. It's a 610 calorie differential. You can't ignore that, because 610 calories every day is about 63 pounds over a year. So for some of you, especially some of the ladies in the session here, you're pretty small. I mean, you're not heavy people, so your protein needs are not going to be that high. But if I've got a 240-pound athlete, or God forbid, I got a 300-pound lineman who may need, 320 grams of protein on a daily basis, can you imagine how much food, time, cost, preparation is needed to get there, right? So sometimes protein powders add convenience. They can be a time efficient, cost efficiency, and they can become a good complement, because they're not going to provide all the nutrients that all those other foods provide. We know that. But sometimes it's a nice balance, right? But here's the one caveat that you have to pay attention. Because proteins are not regulated by the FDA to the same degree that foods and drugs are, this leaves a little bit of opportunity for the manufacturers to cut some corners. What I mean by that is, if you think about it, if I'm selling a protein powder, excuse me, the one thing you're looking for out of the protein powder is to get results, muscle gain. Well, what if I could give you an advantage? How do I do that? What if I was to spike your protein powder? When I say spike, what do you mean by spike? Well, what if I threw a little bit of anabolic steroids in there? Now, for you and I, if you're not a professional athlete or a college athlete, that may not make a difference, and you might not even know it. But for someone who's being tested for banned substances, for any, performance enhancing drugs, we call them PEDs. Think about that. They might unknowingly just go down to a store, buy this product off the shelf, so like from a GNC or a bodybuilding.com or something, and not know that this thing has been spiked. And then they take it, and then they're required to do their testing, and wham, they lose their scholarship, lose their contracts, lose whatever. So how do we know if the FDA is not testing for banned substances and even just harmful substances, that these products are safe? Well, that's where you come in with these third-party agencies. I've listed two of the primary ones right there. LGC Labs, which goes by the logo Informed Choice, and the National Sanitation Foundation, NSF. What they both do now is they're both playing in the space where they'll go take your product off the shelves. Right? So just like every consumer is buying it off the shelf, they go take it off the shelves, and they will go test it for anything that is on the WADA, which is the World Anti-Doping Association banned substance list. They'll test everything. And if you are clean, then you can wear that badge. It's like a badge of honor. Now you have to pay the company. So if you're like Optimum Nutrition or your EAS or your, Isopure, whoever you are, you need to pay these companies to go do that independent testing so that you can have that badge of honor. Because every professional organization, so from college athletes into the pros, they tell their athletes, do not take protein powders that do not have any of one of these two logos on it. This is your safety, it's your badge of assurance. NSCF goes a little further than Informed Choice. They don't just look at banned substances, they also look at quality of ingredients and purity of manufacturing to make sure there's no cross-contamination of your food or anything like that. So NSF's just maybe considered to be a little bit more robust in their testing. But the bottom line is this: you might see two products on the shelf. One of them seems to be a little cheaper. I know sometimes we think, well, I got to stretch my dollar and its value, but I would tell you, just for your interests and for your own safety and health, take a look at the packages. If one of them has one of these logos and one doesn't, you should choose the one that has these logos. It's just a safer bet. The cost is not going to be that significant. All right. What will determine the cost differential is the type of protein, not whether it's accredited or not. All right. Okay. So that was just kind of an introductory little statement there. Let's talk now about the three pillars: quality, quantity, and timing. There's many ways that we've been able to, over the years, to assess protein quality. You might have heard of biological value, PD-CAS scores. There's all these different ways that we could say, what is the quality of the protein that I'm eating? How do I know that this vegetable protein is better or worse than that animal protein? And how do I know that this animal protein is worse or better than that animal-based protein? We've had a series of different tests along the way. Some people have purely looked at the food and they've done assays of the food. The problem is that food doesn't necessarily represent what's in your body. We've also looked at what comes in, what comes out the other end. And that doesn't always necessarily represent what you're absorbing or assimilating, because your intestinal bacteria can also use proteins and they can change things. So in 2014, a new system was adopted. This is the system you're seeing in front of you. It's called a DIAS score. United Nations has now adopted it, and everyone's starting to adopt it now. And what a DIAS score is simply a measurement of protein that's been ingested, and then before it gets to the large intestine, so before the bacterial colony in your large intestine get to it. In other words, at the terminal end of your small intestine, they will aspirate the remnants out of the body. Now, they don't do it with humans. No human is going to volunteer for that. They do it with pigs, right? But essentially, it's the same crumpled thing, because the pig's digestive system is very similar to the humans, right? And what they're looking at is the quality of protein. In other words, of that protein, first of all, what was that? How good was that protein? And more importantly, how much of it are you absorbing into the body? And they've created a scoring system, and you can see there's the scoring system. Obviously, the higher the score, the better the protein value. So you can kind of see there, unfortunately, for people that don't eat animal-based products, that your highest protein scores lie with your animal-based proteins. Now, most of us have known this, that animal-based proteins are assimilated into the body more effectively than vegetable-based proteins. But there are some vegetable-based proteins. Look towards the bottom of the left-hand side. You've got soy isolate, pea isolate, oatmeal, and pea concentrate. They're decent numbers. They're not fantastic, but they're decent numbers. What I'm concerned about is when they drop to the bottom side of the right column. When I ask someone who's a vegan, they say, where do you get most of your protein? They say, well, I do beans, I do corn, I do almonds, I do rice. You're getting horrible protein into your body. Just to give you an example, if you look at, say, milk, and let's just take an average score of 1.2, just to make my math easy here. And then I'm going to take something like, let's say, almonds at 0.4. I'm just going to use those numbers right there. That means if you took 10 grams of each of them, the quality of protein, which represents the type of amino acid and how much you'd get into the body, is 3 times higher with the milk than it is with the almond. So, and again, I don't mean to slam, but I've got to illustrate the point here. Think of people that are drinking almond milk instead of cow's milk. And if they say, well, the reason is I like milk because I get good quality protein, I have to tell you, you're not. Because first of all, if you look at the label, almond milk only has about 1 gram of protein, whereas regular cow's milk has about 8 to 9 grams of protein. And that's the first problem. The second problem is look at the DIAS scores. It's 1/3 of the value when you look at almond milk versus milk. So not only do you get less protein, you're also getting 1/3 of the efficiency of absorption plus the quality of protein into your body. So that becomes a bit of a challenge. So the important thing to do is to make sure that you are picking a variety of proteins, but more importantly, having a good sources of protein in your diet, a collection of good sources of protein. I'm not saying be a carnivore all the time. I'm a big fan of implementing more vegetable-based proteins into our diet. I think it's important for your health. It's important for the sustainability of our planet. But I think you have to look at the reality of the facts. All right. So when you're looking at a label or you're choosing between proteins, you should always keep this in mind. What's become kind of the forefront of protein discussion and protein research has been the idea of how do I get this protein to trigger muscle protein synthesis? Well, we found one amino acid that seems to be the pivotal amino acid in your diet, and it's called leucine. And so we've identified there's also this thing called a leucine threshold. And what we mean by that is it appears that in order to enjoy optimal opportunity for muscle protein synthesis, there has to be a certain amount of leucine getting into the muscle cells. Now, it doesn't mean leucine by itself is going to build muscle, right? Leucine is just it's like the light switch. It turns on the process optimally because you need all the building blocks. So you're going to need a lot of other amino acids. And I'll explain that little detail in the next slide. But leucine seems to be the linchpin. So researchers have been struggling to try and figure out what is the perfect amount of leucine. Well, we don't have a perfect number because it seems like it's not a fixed number. But it appears that the consensus right now is that this leucine threshold seems to start at a dosage of what you're eating, the amount of leucine that ultimately will get into your body needs to be sitting around the 2-gram level. So it could be between 1.7 and 2.4 grams as a minimal end of this leucine threshold. And we've seen numbers up to about 4 grams for a big male. So that seems to be the threshold, but apparently that threshold is not fixed either because it does seem to change. So when someone starts doing resistance training on a consistent basis, and they are in a process of constantly building, it seems like that threshold can drop a little bit. By comparison, we see it go the other way. When you become inactive or you age, it seems to climb. So that leucine threshold gets a little higher. In other words, you need more leucine to trigger muscle protein synthesis as you get older. And that might explain why some older adults don't build muscle protein synthesis at the same rate that a young person does. People say, well, why do older adults build muscle protein more slowly than older adults? Younger adults build it more rapidly than older adults. And the question has been, well, we've always talked about, well, it's a use it or lose it, but we're not talking about the loss of muscle protein. We're talking about building muscle protein. Well, one possible explanation is we know that as we age, we don't absorb protein as well as we do when we're younger. So you may not be getting enough leucine into your body. But more importantly, we're also believing that as we age, the leucine threshold goes up. So even if you're getting the same amount as a 25-year-old and you're 65, it may not be enough because your leucine threshold might be a little higher. So we're starting to understand a little bit more about this, but we're not there yet. But the idea is this. Every time you take a feeding of protein, you should be striving, let's call it 2 grams, to get to at least 2 grams of leucine in whatever food source, excuse me, you're eating. So that brings us to this. Protein shake. It's my second protein feeding of the day. Okay, so you can see this is a assays of leucine levels in many common food sources. Now, this is a amount of leucine in a 100-gram serving. You would never consume a 100-gram serving. You probably will consume a 25-gram serving, but this is just how they do their research, right? Now, if you look across all the foods, you can see whey isolate, milk, egg white, pea isolate, egg. I've got a bunch of different foods there. And you can see the leucine levels. And you can see, ironically, that the highest amount of leucine is actually held in a pea isolate, 10.42 grams in comparison to the whey isolate, which is 10.2, and then milk, which is about 9.8. So everyone's going to sit there and raise the flag and go, look at how good pea isolate is. However, don't just for a moment think that that's the end all, because you've got to come back and look at the DIA score. It may have more protein in the food on the label, but you've also got to consider the DIA score. And if you look at the whey isolate, it has a DIA score of 1.25, whereas a pea isolate has about a 0.95. That's about a 25% differential. So even though there's slightly more pea isolate more leucine in pea isolate than there is a whey isolate, you're still going to end up, if you had 10 grams of each, with probably more leucine in your body with the whey isolate than you would with the pea isolate because of the DIA score. So just to give you an idea, if you were to try and get 2 grams of leucine into your body, you'd have to consume about 12 to 15 grams of a whey isolate and about 17 to 21 grams of a pea isolate, just to kind of give you some perspective. These numbers start to make a difference because they are a cost issue and there's a calorie issue right there. And so you can kind of see when different foods were consumed, you can see when 25 grams of whey exceeded the leucine threshold, but when soy and rice were given, it didn't, because first of all, they have less leucine in them. There's soys, and then we can go look at, there's brown rice, all right? We can see that the leucine levels are low, but they also have what? Oops, wrong direction. They also have lower DIAS scores. Right? You can see the DIAS score for rice is not that great, right? So that in itself is a problem. And then of course, when they gave people, you know, large dosages of rice and soy, yeah, they got over the leucine, but now you got to think cost and calories. Now, interesting one was the big one. So sure, when they gave people a little bit of whey with a lot of leucine, yeah, of course, that's going to take you over the leucine level. It's to be expected. I just gave you 5 grams of leucine. But what was interesting is when they just gave people BCAAs, so most of you are familiar, you see them right there, of a particular group of amino acids called branched chain amino acids. So branched chain amino acids are a particular group where their sort of side structure is unique, but why they're important is because they're primarily involved in muscle protein synthesis, and they make up 30 to 35% of your muscle protein amino acids. So sure, if I gave you BCAAs, the idea would be, would that help build muscle mass? Well, the interesting thing is when they gave BCAAs by themselves, even though they gave people enough leucine, it did not trigger muscle protein synthesis. What does that tell us? Well, as much as leucine is important, being kind of that linchpin, you need to have all the ingredients. It's like you can't build a cake with just flour. You got to have all the ingredients in the appropriate quantities to build. So you can't just take BCAA supplements. You have to take a protein supplement or protein complement, right? So BCAAs have their place, but they're not necessarily designed to by themselves to necessarily build muscle protein. One more thing I want you to consider as we're on this conversation of protein quality, focusing on protein, the types of proteins, and then looking at calories, is take a look at what I've got there. So in the first 2 columns, I compare an egg to a half cup of raw quinoa. Why? Because they both have essentially 3.5 grams of EAAs. EAAs are essential amino acids. Now, they're not comparable. Quinoa doesn't compare on paper against eggs. Remember, the whole egg is Mother Nature's most complete protein because an egg can support life. There's only one complete protein source that we know of, and it's the whole egg, right? Every other amino acid or every other protein source in the world, including milk and everything else, has what we call limiting amino acids. It means that that quantity of that particular amino acid or multiple amino acids is not equal to what we find in the whole egg. So the egg has a specific ratios of all the EAAs that are needed to support life. Just like in the human body, we need certain amino acids in certain ratios. And quinoa is limited in tryptophan and methionine, 2 essential amino acids, which means you'd only build enough of what you are trying to build until you run out of the methionine, the tryptophan you have. Fortunately, those aren't necessarily that critical for muscle protein synthesis. But here's the catch. Egg and quinoa, even though you might say, well, we're going to use a half a cup of raw and 1 large egg and have the same amino acids, look at the calories. Raw egg, 75 calories, half a cup of raw quinoa, 315 calories. There's 240 calories difference. So it seems like when you sometimes go to match protein in whole foods, when you match protein quantity, you haven't addressed protein quality, but you've got a calorie differential. So if we look at the other 2 columns, where I'm using 25 grams of whey isolate and 25 grams of a hemp protein powder, they have the same calories, but now look at the protein differences. So the takeaway here is the inevitable, right? Unfortunately, when you look at gram for gram, when you're comparing an animal-based protein to a vegetable-based protein, you know, in whole foods, they're hard to compare. And so if you are going to go the route of getting all your protein from whole foods, what you have to embrace is the reality that there will be a lot more calories in the food that you're eating. But if you opt for the protein powders as a complement, then you're able to do what kind of work around the calories, because a lot of times it's just protein powder. And now there's going to be only a marginal difference between the two, which is really got to do with the DIAS score. But if you are going to choose a protein powder, the pea isolate, remember, don't confuse a pea isolate with a pea protein. So let me go back up here. This DIAS score is everything you look at. You can see where the pea isolate is a 0.95 score, pea concentrate 0.82, and then just pea protein, which is on the next column. Look at peas cooked. That's got a horrible score. So if you're buying a pea-based protein, which is becoming the most popular form, make sure it's either a concentrate or an isolate. If it just says pea protein, you're not getting a very strong protein into your body. So Taylor, you're just talking about it right there. Make sure you're looking at the type of protein that's listed on the ingredients. Make sure it's just not pea protein, but a pea isolate or a pea concentrate, because those do come close to comparing to animal-based proteins. Okay. So moving on, let's now talk about how much we need. Well, we know we get our protein from different sources. We get it from the food we eat, and that food we eat is then assimilated into the body, where it's either built into what we call a reserve, which is called living tissue, that represents 99% of all our usable protein, and of course, most of that being muscle. And then we have these things called amino acid pools. Think of them as little pantries, and they're constantly being replenished as you eat periodically through the day. You are replenishing, because what you're doing with every minute of the day is you are destroying certain cells, right? Think of a red blood cell. It only lives for 4 months. So it's becoming destroyed. We're cannibalizing what we can, but then we need to rebuild. So we need to go to the pantry to get stuff out of there. And that's why you eat protein on a regular basis, right? That's why we have an RDA for protein, so to speak. But that amino acid pool is really small. And remember, that amino acid pool is there for regular maintenance. It's not there to support muscle protein. If you go to the gym and start lifting, that amino acid pool is not intended for that. It's just there for your day-to-day maintenance and repair and everything, right? So obviously we look for the dietary protein to be able to give us additional protein into our body so that we can support this demand or this new need we have for muscle protein growth. Now we have a thing called the RDA, and I think everyone here knows what the RDA is. There's your RDA for protein. It is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. So I've just kind of given you some examples there. Now, the reality is this doesn't change from when you become an adult. So turn 19, so they usually talk about, 19 and above. All the way through the day you die, your protein needs, or that RDA doesn't change. However, research is showing that as we age, we don't absorb protein as effectively as we do when we're younger. And there's some people that advocate that maybe as we age, we need to start consuming more protein. It'd be interesting to see if that ever changes. But right now it's set at 0.8 grams per kilogram. So do me a favor, take your calculators. Just take your phone out. I want you to just find your calculator. I've given you the equivalent in pounds, 0.36 grams per pound. So whatever you weigh, so put in your body weight, times, if you're using kilograms or pounds, times that number, right? And what you have now is an idea of what your, let's call it minimal amount of protein on a day should be. Now, if you're lifting weights and stuff, now that's not what we're talking about. This is just you day-to-day being able to preserve normal physiology where you're doing your normal tissue repair, tissue maintenance, those types of things. So at the very least, you should be getting that much protein in your diet, because if you're not, then you are going to have to cannibalize your living tissue, because that's the biggest pool. If I need some amino acids to build red blood cells and you don't give it to me in my food, I'm going to go get it somewhere else. I'm just going to go attack muscle protein. So it's a very minimal, you should be getting that RDA. It's designed to meet the needs of 97 to 98% of the population. Where are we as Americans? Well, fortunately, most Americans eat more protein than the RDA. You can see the percentages there for males and females. So generally, protein deficiency in America is not that much of a concern. What is a concern is the timing and the type of protein. Those are things we can work on. All right, so we see the RDA, but does that mean that athletes, people that are exercising, so people that have interest in building muscle mass, things of that nature, do they need more protein? The consensus is yes. Both endurance athletes and obviously resistance trained athletes do need more protein. The resistance trained athlete, the reason is pretty obvious. You're going to support muscle growth. The endurance athlete is to augment depletion of glycogen, which then could be cannibalizing your muscle protein. So we'd rather give you some protein to minimize muscle catabolism so that if you are out of glycogen during your endurance training, you can get it from food protein as opposed to from muscle protein. However, when it comes to just the average person who, say, goes to the gym 3 times a week and is just exercising to be healthy, there's really not conclusive evidence that more protein is necessarily needed. The timing of protein becomes more important because, as I just showed you, most Americans are getting enough protein. And when we get into the pre-exercise window, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So if athletes and athletic individuals or people who are serious about building some muscle mass are supposed to take in more protein, the question is how much more? Well, we now have some guidelines. So research has been kind of evolving. We've got some now guidelines, and they've really broken it up into 2 categories. People that participate in light to moderate activity and people that participate in moderate to vigorous activity. You remember, you are much more fit than the average population. So I would imagine everything you do in the gym would be defined as moderate to vigorous. Even if you think this is kind of a easier workout, the definition of moderate is something that most of us, being ENS students, will think of as being kind of light. Right? So I would say put yourselves in the moderate to vigorous category. And then we have guidelines for endurance training and resistance training. So you can kind of see the guidelines right there. So that tells you that your needs on those days that you're training, keyword, on the days that you are training are going to be different than the days you're not training. So on the day that you're not training, you should just go to the RDA. But the days that you are training, based on what type of training you're doing, you should be adjusting your protein accordingly. Now, the definition of endurance training is a person who does more than 10 hours of sport-specific endurance training a week. So you're not just out there like, you know, I go for a run 3 times a week for an hour. I'm an endurance athlete. No, you're just a recreational runner, right? Now, they also put an upper tolerance. There is an upper tolerance that's been set at a range of around 0.91 to 1 gram per pound, or 2 to 2.2 grams per kilograms. We believe that seems to be a threshold, not for everyone, but for some people, because the belief is anything beyond that may be a waste of money because that protein is not being, once absorbed, if it's absorbed, it's not being assimilated into protein tissue. It could be converted to carbs or fats. And 2, there could be a little bit of potential harmful effects, which we'll talk about in the next slide. That too much protein might have potential damage. Now, I'll be honest with you, the research is very scarce. I see some of the chat boxes talking about kidney and liver damage. It's very unlikely, all right? It is always a potential, but the likelihood of it is very slim. But we'll talk about that in the next slide, right? Now, when I say most people, because there has been studies, and there was a study by Portmans and his colleagues that was done in 2000, and they were looking at individuals who were trained bodybuilders, big male bodybuilders, and they were giving them mega doses of protein. You can see the dosages were going well over the 2.2 grams per kilogram. And they were finding that they were still assimilating it into muscle mass. So it seems like people that are serious about their weight training and people that have a little bit of a history with high protein diets can seem to assimilate more protein into their bodies than the average person. So it seems like an adaptation that happens. But nonetheless, they're your guidelines. So next exercise I want you to do is take your calculators, identify where you lie, all right? So you know what your RDA should be. So on the days you're not training, you know what your goal should be for protein. You should be getting that number. Now, if you're someone who does moderate to vigorous resistance training, you can see the range. Now, you don't have to take the bottom end of the range and the up end of the range. You just choose. Maybe on a day that you want to lift heavier, you go slightly higher. A day that you don't lift as heavy, you go a little lower. I generally live in the middle of that range. So my protein intakes that I aim for on days that I train are right smack in the middle of that. So I go, about halfway across. I can't tell you what to choose. You've got to choose your own numbers. So maybe do your numbers quickly for endurance, if you do any endurance training, or for resistance. And that gives you an idea of how much protein you should be striving for on the days that you're doing those types of training. Okay, so now we have a little bit of protein quantity. But the question's being asked, I see a few of you bringing up the question about, is too much protein a concern? Yes. It's not just a financial concern because, let's be honest, protein is expensive. And if you're not absorbing it, then it's just being wasted. Because there's 2 options. Number 1, you may not even be absorbing it into your body. Because remember, your intestinal tract is like a conveyor belt. And there's only a small section of the small intestine where you really assimilate protein up into the body. And if you've got too much protein coming in at once, there's just not enough surface area for all of it to be absorbed, which means it's going to miss that window of opportunity. And then it's just going down the other side. It's going into the large intestine. That means a bit of a waste of your money. So apart from that, all right, it's also a little bit of a health concern. So as I've talked to you, as the conversation started right here, right? If I've got too much protein in my body and I can't store it, because remember, 99% of protein is stored as living tissue. So if I'm not going to be able to convert it to living tissue, why? Maybe I don't have the training stimulus, I don't have the genetic predisposition, whatever it is. Then what does it become? Well, we all know that excess proteins can be converted to anything else. You can convert it to glucose, convert it to fat. Now, in order to do that, there has to be something removed from that amino acid structure. We have to remove the amino group because the amino group has nitrogen in it, and nitrogen has no place in carbs and fats. So this concept called deamination is what has to happen. We have to physically remove the amino group. And as the amino group is removed, it forms a toxic compound called ammonia that then is quickly converted to urea. And then that is all passed from the liver to the kidneys. So yeah, it's putting a lot of bit of stress on the liver and the kidneys. So that brings up the logical question. Will it create liver disease or liver issues? Will it create kidney issues? It can. Keyword, can. Right? The reality is the research has not showed that happening very often. It's very scarce that it'll happen. If you have a normal functioning liver and a normal functioning kidney, a small, a dose that's maybe a little bit more than what you probably need is going to be completely harmless for your entire life. If you're someone that has a history of renal or hepatic issues, you probably should be talking to a dietitian or a doctor because maybe that could be dangerous. But there are two other concerns that have been raised. All right. So while the liver and the kidney issues, and remember, I think I saw something about liver fat. Very unlikely. I mean, protein is probably the last thing in your body that will be converted to fats. Carbs will have more of a problem of converting to fats, especially excess amounts of fructose. We see studies where you're taking in about 100 grams of fructose on a daily basis that can start to lead to a fatty liver. The reality is most Americans don't consume more than about 50 to 55 grams of fructose. So the likelihood of your liver becoming fatty because of protein, it's very rare. You'd have to be consuming mega amounts of protein. I'm talking about like 5, 6, 7 times the RDA, because there's very little research saying that high protein diets create a fatty liver. It can put a little bit of stress on the liver, but most livers are resilient enough to handle that, all right? Okay, just before I go on, I got some questions popping up. So is that high protein absorption for athletes due to genetic mutation? I wouldn't say. I would just say it's a general adaptation, just like your cardiovascular system adapts. Every biological system can go through an adaptation. Right? I would just think it's basically just like you adapt yourself to the stress of running, your body can adapt itself to high protein intakes because it has a high protein need. So I wouldn't say it's a mutation, it's just an adaptation. Taylor says, what can you do to better absorb pea protein isolate? Well, that's about it. Water. Don't have any other foods with it. So drink it by itself, because the problem with any foods, if you put fiber or fats into foods, it can bind up some protein. So I would just say take it with nothing but water. That would probably be the only way you can improve the absorbability of pea protein isolate. But that's as good as it gets. Outside of that, if you want something better, you might have to change your protein source. Okay. Looking at other functions, you're making urea that has to be flushed out. So the issue is you need volume of fluid to push that urea out. So urine volume will go up with high protein diets, which then brings in the question of dehydration. So that's I wouldn't say harmful side effect, but it is a downside because hydration is critical to everything. I mean, your myofascia, your recovery, your efficacy of your workouts. So generally on higher protein diets, you got to make sure that you increase your fluid intakes to offset for that potential loss of urea that's going to take a lot of fluid out with it. But there is one concern that's been raised, and this one, it's misdirected because there's really not much truth to it, but there is an argument that's being made, and I just want to share it with you. It's this idea that when we look at the American diet is heavily favored in animal protein diets. Absolute truth. We're about 85%, 15% in comparison to plants. And we know that that's potential huge impacts on the environment. We know that. So yeah, we should be getting more plant-based proteins because they're also healthier, but they also can help us save this damn world, right? Which we don't seem to care much about, unfortunately. But there is another question that comes out of this. Animal-based proteins tend to be a little bit more acidic in nature. They're a little bit more acidifying, maybe that's the better word, acidifying in nature than plant-based proteins. What does that mean? That means when they're in your blood, so you eat and those amino acids go into your blood, because of the more acidifying nature of the types of amino acids that we find more in animal-based proteins, things like cysteine and stuff like that, and proline, hydroxyproline, these tend to do what? Change the pH of your blood. So what does the body need to do? It needs to neutralize that acidifying effect, that lowering of your pH. Well, amino acids are negatively charged, so we'd naturally buffer them with something that is positively charged. One thing you can buffer with is calcium. It's a positively charged ion. And if you don't have enough calcium in your diet, well, there's a place you can go get it from. Your biggest mineral reserve in the body is in your bones for calcium, and we could pull some calcium out of the bones. So there's been some people that have said, hey, you got to be careful. If you eat too much animal-based proteins, you could be demineralizing your bones. Is there a truth to that? There were some studies that were done that were really poorly designed that showed that. And I say poorly designed because what we've seen is studies have then since replicated this and said, hang on a second, if you're looking at, say, dairy protein, we know dairy is a great source of calcium, but what we also know about animal-based proteins like casein, not all of them, but just some of them, is they're wonderful at absorbing more calcium into your body. So if you were getting a lot of protein, and especially if it was coming from dairy, this becomes more of a moot point because if you have more acidifying amino acids in your blood and you need more calcium, well, the calcium is going to come from all that wonderful calcium that's being absorbed with casein in your milk. So those studies showed there's no demineralization of your bones. So it's really a moot point. But if you were ever yourself or working with someone who had a history of bone disease, probably not a bad idea to talk to your dietitian or doctor about it. Now, we're talking about too much protein. And as I mentioned earlier, most Americans are eating more than protein than they need. But there's this research that's coming out, and I'm citing one of the studies there, right, that maybe older adults do need more protein because they don't absorb as much. And maybe that's why they suffer this condition called sarcopenia, that it might be partially attributed to this loss of muscle mass as we age. Loss of muscle as we age because of the fact that we're not absorbing protein. So we're having to attack muscle protein. So there you have a little bit of a conversation on the concerns around high protein intakes. All right, let's drill this thing down to one meal. How much should I eat one meal? Well, it's pretty hard to say specifically, right? Because there's a lot of variables that you can see. There's a lot of variables there. We're going to talk about a few of them. But here's the idea. Given what we know, we've given some recommendations. When I say we, researchers, not me, researchers have given recommendations. That generally the upper threshold for males in one sitting is about 50 grams of protein. For females, it's around 30 grams of protein. And what does that mean? Does that mean we should all go towards upper threshold? No, because that's just a upper threshold, generally research conducted on, say, a big male or a more athletic female. So the normal range recommendations are in a meal, a good amount for a male in a sitting would be somewhere between 25 and 30 grams, and for a female between 15 and 20 grams. Well, think about it. You just did your numbers. And if you needed 100 grams or 120 grams or 150 grams, it tells you that you're going to have multiple feedings through the day, which goes back to what I started with. At least 4 feedings through the day is generally recommended to support optimal muscle protein synthesis in your body. So if you were taking 30 grams a meal, 4 times a day, that would give you 120 grams. That number is aligned with what you need. Perfect. You're good to go. But if you still need another 40 grams, you may have to consider additional feedings through the day. There's nothing wrong with having 5, 6, 7 feedings of protein through the day. It's just a minimum of 4 is considered to be that, that lowest threshold. All right. So we've talked a bit about the protein quality and protein quantity. Let's go take a little sidebar here. Let's talk about what's in proteins that we eat, and then we'll start talking about the timing. So I'm going to start with milk-based proteins because they are the most popular, right? Now, when you take milk and you break out all the components that make up milk, protein makes up just a small part of milk, right? Milk is mostly water. And then the 20% that's not water, you break that into the pie chart, and 26.6% of that 20% is protein. And then we take protein out and we can break it up further into what we call whey and casein. Whey being soluble protein, casein being insoluble protein. Now you notice how it's almost like a 4-to-1 ratio. I've got it as 80-20. It's not quite, it's like 78-22, but it's close enough. What does that mean? Well, let's go take to the store. You decide, I'm going to go buy a protein powder. So what do? You see two different protein powders on the shelf. And you look at one and it's, for a 4-pound jug, it's $49.99. And then next to it is a 4-pound jug that's $34.99. Why is it $15 cheaper? It must be a worse, inferior protein. May not be. Read the ingredients. The $49.99 might be a whey isolate. The $34.99 might be a casein-based protein. When you harness a gallon of milk, you're going to get a hell of a lot more casein than you are whey. So it just tells you that whey is going to be more expensive to manufacture. That's why it costs more. Casein is not an inferior protein. It's a different protein, but it's not inferior. So quickly, what's the difference between the two? Well, the biggest difference is one is soluble, one is insoluble. What does that mean? Well, this is where we bring in the words fast protein, slow protein. On an empty stomach with water, you can drink a whey shake. It can be in your blood in 15 to 20 minutes. So I take a sip on an empty stomach. It's a whey isolate. Could be in my blood in 15 to 20 minutes. Casein, by comparison, could take hours. There's been some research saying 4, 6, 8 hours. Because I mentioned this earlier, it's an insoluble protein. So the moment it gets into your stomach and it mixes with your stomach acids, it denatures and it forms these big old clumps, and they have to be systematically broken down into like this cream of wheat texture before they can even leave the stomach. And that just takes time. That's why it's called a slow protein. So what's ironic and interesting about milk is milk represents the fastest and the slowest proteins. Everything else fits inside of them. So when you need a fast protein, there is nothing faster than whey. If you happen to want a slow protein, there's nothing slower than casein. So it means there's a specific time for each of them. They're not to be taken at the same time or in the same situations, because sometimes you need protein rapidly, sometimes you want a more slow delivery. What's good about these proteins? Well, they're both great sources of BCAAs. You saw that previously. What else? They both have good quantities of an amino acid called glutamine. What is glutamine? Glutamine is what we call a conditionally essential amino acid. It's not by definition essential, but anytime your body's stressed and trying to recover from a stressful event like a workout, your immune system needs to replenish itself. And we find that glutamine actually helps the immune system replenish itself. So having some extra gluten, more than what your body produces, has been shown to actually help accelerate recovery. Recovery from illness, recovery from surgery, recovery from a workout, right? So generally having a little bit of glutamine in the protein that you're consuming is not a bad thing. But here's the other point to consider. Glutamine is the most abundant amino acid, so you find it everywhere. So you don't have to necessarily worry about supplementing it. Just read how much gluten is on the label. And if you're getting about 3 to 5 grams in a serving, post-exercise, it's probably enough. Whey goes one step further. Whey has a amino acid called cysteine. And why cysteine is important? Because cysteine is part of a pathway that makes a very powerful antioxidant called glutathione. And glutathione helps, being an antioxidant, helps fight the accumulation of what we call free radicals, unstable oxygen elements, reactive oxygen species, whatever you want to call them. So that can also help what? It can help prevent, the damage to tissue, can help you recover. So whey has been shown to be actually a good recovery protein because it has both glutamine and cysteine levels in it. So we can take whey and we can take it through several processes where we can just take the whey stream and just let it dry out. We got a whey powder, but we can also run it through these filters like I talked about earlier, where we can go to whey concentrate and a whey isolate. Look at the difference in protein as you go all the way to the whey isolate. You got 10 grams of protein powder, and if it's a whey powder, a whey concentrate, a whey isolate, look how much difference there will be in the protein concentration. But I said to you that most of this protein that's made comes through the cheese making process. You can see all the steps involved. Pasteurization, several times, pressure filtration. And what actually ends up happening is some of the protein gets destroyed, gets damaged. Proteins can be destroyed by temperature. They can be destroyed by pressure, force. One company in America, who is now the largest cheese manufacturer in America, or essentially one of the largest cheese manufacturers in America, actually has a very proprietary way of making protein powder. They call it native whey. They take milk straight to protein powder. None of this milk to cheese, cheese to protein. No, they just go milk straight to protein powder. You can see it's several steps fewer than the traditional process. And what you end up with is a protein powder that actually has 18% more leucine. Gram for gram, milk versus milk, 18% more leucine. Everyone thinks that must be the best protein to take. Theoretically it is, but it's also the most expensive. What you'd pay for a 2-gram bag of it is about the same price you'll pay for a 2-pound bag of this type of protein is about the same price you'll pay for a 4-pound bag of regular protein. It's more expensive, but it is the best protein out there. Now, the company that makes this is only one company in America because they own this patent. It's called Ascent, A-S-C-E-N-T. Now, I will tell you this. They've just come out with a protein drink. So if you go to ascent.com, they've got a protein drink, which I think is, to be honest with you, I've taken protein water. I've had these different products where it's a drinkable protein that you can have after your workout. But the problem is the taste. It's very chalky. And when you're thirsty, it doesn't really quench your thirst. They've come out with 3 flavors. And I will tell you, their coconut pineapple is amazing. It's got, I think, 25 grams of their protein in it, or it could be 20 grams, but it's got electrolytes. It's basically a post-exercise drink, right? Which gives you it could be 20 to 25 grams. I don't know. I have them in my refrigerator, right? If you guys want, I can go run and get one. If you guys want to wait a minute, I'll go grab it. That way you can see what I'm talking about. Hang on a second. I'll go grab it for you. Okay, so as I was talking about, so these are some of the products we see out there. This is called Protein 2.0. So it's like a protein drink. 20 grams of protein, but the problem is you drink this and it's very chalky. This is the Ascent product I was talking about. So there you can see the Ascent logo. It's called Recovery Water. This is their pineapple coconut. It's not cheap. They're like $3.50 a bottle. But it's got 20 grams and then it's got electrolytes and everything else. And this actually drinks like a normal beverage. So it's actually a very enjoyable drink to have. So as I said, it's probably some of the best protein out there, but it's not cheap. That's the problem with it, all right? The other type of protein we get out there is called hydrolysate. Hydrolysate just means pre-digested. So what that means is they took the protein and before you actually consumed it, they just broke the big protein strands into smaller peptide chains. Their claim is that it's going to improve absorbability. Not necessarily, all right, because most of us have the right enzymes in our stomach where we can actually do what? We can actually unravel those big protein strands. So unless you're something like like a person who has some stomach issues or maybe lack of enzymes in your stomach, there shouldn't be a problem for you. This was developed for colicky babies because they couldn't unravel those big protein strands. Now I tell you what you can do is try it. If you've ever heard of the protein crunch bars, there are hydrolysates. They're not necessarily better proteins. Some people just stomach them a little easier, no pun intended. And I tell people, if you feel better taking that protein, take it. But generally, the price point is a little higher than regular whey isolates. If you feel better taking it, take it. But if you don't see any difference, then to me, it doesn't justify the price. Anyhow, you can get it. Again, full disclosure, I don't work for any of these companies. I get no royalties or anything, but I'm just letting you know, I wish I was getting royalties from this because I love this stuff, but I'd get it for free, but I can't. So I have to pay just like we all have to pay for it. All right. So what do we know about casein and whey? Which is better than what? Well, the biggest thing is the fact that one's a fast protein, one's a slow protein makes a big difference. The fast protein gets in your body very quickly, which means post-exercise, when you end your workout, you're going to go into this post-exercise anabolic window, which lasts for about 4 to 6 hours. They found that within the first few hours, when people were taking whey over casein, they were seeing initially much higher rates of protein synthesis. They were increased over versus casein. That's a good idea. But what was interesting is when they looked 7 hours post-exercise, they were looking at protein status. And they found that the people that were eating casein were demonstrating high levels of leucine in the blood, which was keeping them more in an anabolic state and less in a catabolic state. Why? Because the protein is being delivered more slowly. So even though whey has more leucine than casein, when they looked 7 hours later, they found, wow, look at the difference. But here's the caveat. Most of you don't go 7 hours without food unless you're doing it overnight. So this would be a moot point, because let's say I worked out now and I had a whey right after my workout, I would enjoy a nice increased rate of muscle protein synthesis over the casein. And then if I'm worried about 7 hours later, well, hell, I should have eaten something. Maybe 4 hours later, I ate another source of protein. So I wouldn't have to worry about that, because now I've got more protein coming into my body. So again, this was an interesting study, but it doesn't reflect life, because most of us don't go 7 hours after a workout without eating, unless your workout happens to be in the evening. That's where you might want to think about some casein before you go to bed. And we're going to talk about that too. All right. Egg-based protein. Egg is a viable option. Some people don't like dairy. They have sensitivity to dairy, right? People talk about the lactose. You don't have to worry about it. There's no lactose in whey protein, right? Whey isolate, sorry. There's no lactose in it. There is some lactose in whey concentrates. It's been removed out of the whey isolates. Egg-based has a very good DIA score. We saw it, right? Problem with egg-based protein, it's pretty salty. So you've got to really put a lot of sweeteners in it to kind of take that salty taste away. And it also doesn't dissolve as well as milk-based protein. So you got to kind of shake it up a lot. So whey is naturally quick and easy to dissolve. Casein, as I said, is insoluble. So what they use is a micellular casein, where they take the casein globules and break them down into smaller pieces so that it will dissolve itself into water. But you still got to shake it quite vigorously. Egg, same thing. You got to shake it pretty vigorously. Egg, because it's not mass produced to the same degree as dairy-based protein, is probably gram for gram a little bit more expensive than dairy, but it is a viable option. The one that's becoming very popular now is collagen. Collagen has always been used. So think of it, ladies, you've always been using collagen creams, because what is collagen? It's our skin, all right? It's part of our connective tissue. I don't want to just gross you out, but you know where it's made from? How they make the collagen powders that you will buy in the store and that you will put into your creams. It comes from the hide, it comes from the bones and the cartilage of cattle. So once they've taken all the meat off and they've used that, sent that to the butcher, the bones and the hide, they don't just throw that out. They grind it down to crunch and they extract all the collagen out of there, and it's just a dry powder that's put in there. Collagen is very dissolvable. It's tasteless. It has no smell, no taste, right? Its DIA score is not great, all right? It's not as great as, say, egg and dairy. And the problem is, remember, it's coming from the bone, so it's very high in calcium. So some people have concerns with too much calcium. They take large amounts of collagen. You can develop kidney stones from hypercalcemia. So too much calcium, be careful with that too. But there is an interesting thing with it. So why do people like to take collagen? Because it has certain amino acids like glycine, proline, and hydroxyproline. These are amino acids that are what are the building blocks of collagen in our body. And collagen itself has a lot more of it than milk does. So that's why some people that like it, they say, oh, it's going to help build better connective tissue. It's not absorbed as well, but it does help. So there is an argument for this. But what I do like about collagen is that it contains glycine and arginine, all right? And those are two important amino acids in making creatine. And bodybuilders love creatine because it creates a volumizing effect, pulling more water into the muscle cells, and they can get big size. So what people are finding on collagen is that it seems to help people bulk up at very impressive rates. I'm not going to say they're initially better than whey, but at impressive rates. And it's because of the ingredients, the amount of amino acids of glycine and arginine that are in collagen actually help increase the amounts of creatine production. But if you were taking creatine as a supplement, then that would be a moot point. But if you weren't taking, and you were a responder to creatine, because not everyone responds to creatine, it might be able to help you, all right? Okay, let's move on, Nick, because I've got to be sensitive to time here. So we've talked about animal-based proteins. Here's just a little bit of a comparison. You guys can kind of go through comparison. I'm looking at the, kind of different things in it. You can kind of see how they compare against each other. Let's talk about vegetable-based proteins. Very quickly, I'm going to talk about your soy, because by definition, soy is the best vegetable-based protein out there. And then, of course, we'll talk about pea. The problem with soy in its natural form is that it has a good thing, fiber, which is good for you, but it also has high or elevated levels of what we call phytoestrogens. These phytoestradiol are concerning because they can naturally raise a person's estrogen levels. And that's a potential health risk. For ladies, it could be potentially predispose them to greater risk of breast cancer, right? So it is a concern. That's why a lot of people are a little concerned about too much soy in their diets, right? But it also has, I think there's been a little bit of exaggeration of it, because if you think about it, you look at the consumption of soy in Southeast Asia versus America. Women in Southeast Asia eat a hell of a lot more soy than American women do, and they have a lower incidence of breast cancer. So there's not necessarily a direct causative relationship between soy and breast cancer. There is some belief that there is a play in there, but we don't exactly know how they're directly connected, because we can't explain the low prevalence of breast cancer in Southeast Asia. But here's one thing you can do. Just like milk, soy can be taken from soy flour, to a soy concentrate, to a soy isolate. We do the exact same thing. We can take the liquid form of soy and push it through these filters and everything. And what can we do? We can remove the fiber, which is not a good thing, but it also removes a lot of the fats. Those phytoestrogens can be removed, which means a soy isolate is probably not going to elevate your estrogen levels as a female or even as a male, but mostly we're more concerned with females. So a soy isolate generally will have no risk. But here's the problem. The public has gravitated to this concept that too much soy is not healthy for us. And so soy powders are no longer popular, right? They're still around, but they're not that popular anymore because of this perception, so to speak, which then leads us to the most popular protein powder that's out there, and which is the only one you should consider, in my opinion. If you're not going to have soy isolates, the only other vegetable-based protein of worth is the pea isolate, right? So again, I talked earlier, pea protein, not good. Pea concentrate, pea isolate, those would be the ones you should consider, all right? When you buy pea protein, the problem is it's still got a lot of carbs in it. It's just like buying the whey, right? It's got a lot of carbs. So pea proteins generally have a lot more carbs, a lot more calories. Pea isolates will be lower in calories and greater density of protein. So that's what you want to look at. And I've given you a little comparison of the pea and the soy isolate there against some of the wheys and collagens. You can see they're pretty good, right? Not necessarily bad there. So these are, to me, are all viable options. Just make sure if it's pea and if it's soy, I would favor the isolates, right? Okay, so in the time I have left, I want to quickly start shooting through strategies that you can do before, during, and after. So now that we have a better understanding of what proteins are, we've talked about how much you need and how they all differ in quality. Let's talk about when you should be taking them. So this was a very important study. This was a study that was done, all right, where they started looking at giving people, they were giving them 80 grams of protein, but they really broke it up into, one group was given 20 grams of protein 4 times through the day. Another group was given 40 grams of protein twice a day. And the third group was given 10 grams of protein 8 times a day. And they were looking at who was generating the greatest levels of muscle protein synthesis. And what they found is that the group that was getting the 10 grams 8 times a day, they were not seeing great muscle protein synthesis rates in comparison to the best group, because the amount of protein being given each time was not necessarily enough to really hit that leucine threshold that we've talked about. And so that was what was holding them back. So it seems like a little bit of protein in a feeding is not a good thing. On the flip side, all right, when the groups were given 20 grams or 40 grams, they did hit threshold, but then they found a difference between them. The group that was getting fed 4 times a day was hitting that threshold more times through the day versus the group that was only getting it twice a day. And what they found is that the net through the day is the group that was being fed a minimum of 4 times a day, right, getting enough protein to hit the leucine threshold, was showing the best rates of muscle protein synthesis. And that's why we have this takeaway that you should be feeding at least 4 times a day, and it should be a decent amount of protein. So an egg by itself is probably not enough, because an egg only has about 7 grams of protein. So it needs to be a dosing where if it's, I showed you earlier, maybe 15 to 25 to 30 grams of protein, depending on what you're taking, that can get you to that leucine threshold. Now, there's also something else, right? So you can see there, what's the consensus? If we're going to feed more frequently, we should be thinking about feeding, say, every 3, maybe every 4 hours. So now you want to plan your day to make sure that you're getting protein feedings through the day. That means don't wake up and wait till 11 o'clock to eat and say, well, I'll get for more, because you've already gone through a fasting period where you might be in muscle catabolism. Get your protein feeding in early and kind of work yourself through the day that way. You can see the protein distributed throughout the day showed a 25% greater increase in muscle protein synthesis versus people that are doing what? Back ending or front ending. So people that are taking all the protein in the latter part of the day or just in the front of the day. So think about those 16/8s. It's a very popular trend right now. 16/8, what am I doing? Oh, I'm going to just do what? I'm going to eat from 8 to 12, from 12 p.m. to 8 p.m. and then nothing till the next day. You're seeing that you're slowing down your muscle protein synthesis rate. So recommendation is...
Good, how are you?
Haley, let me mute you on that one. There we go. So we want to basically think about, just kind of eating periodically through the day. And they kind of give us a target. So these researchers provided a target. They said, try and aim for 0.18 grams per pound. So everyone do me a favor, grab your calculator one more time. All right. And put your body weight in there. And just multiply that by 0.18. And that should be a target of what they would like you to get. So even though the study looked at 10 grams, 20 grams, and 40 grams, they're actually recommending that use that dose. So for me, it says 33 grams. So what they're suggesting to me is that every time I eat a protein, whether it's a shake or a meal, I should be trying to target around 33 grams of protein if you're doing it at least 4 times a day. And now if you're doing it 5 times, 6 times a day, you could probably break that out. You could parcel it out a little smaller. But that's kind of a guideline that's been given to us. So you just did your body weight in pounds or kilograms, and you multiply by that factor. And that gives you an idea of what you should be targeting in every meal if possible. All right, so it takes a bit of planning. Okay, another study was interesting that they looked at this one. And what they found here is that it's been this question of whether protein before exercise and protein after exercise, which is better. So years ago, some researchers demonstrated that protein feeding before exercise actually elevated muscle protein synthesis after exercise. Now, there's been some studies that haven't replicated that, saying, wait a minute, we haven't been able to see the same thing. So in this one study, what they did is they said, well, let's do a pre-feeding and a post-feeding. Let's compare them. And they actually found there's no differences. So people that took protein before the workout, people that took protein after the workout, they didn't see any differences in their strength gains, their muscle, their performance, strength and performance gains. So it really tells you that you can basically feed before or feed after. I actually just recommend bookending both sides. I actually take people to take protein before and after. Why? Because I'm going to put you in this anabolic state before you go into your workout. And then we know the exercise is going to make you catabolic. And then I want to get you quickly back into an anabolic state after your workout. So I like to bookend the workouts. But they found this, that if you were eating protein, that dosage that I just told you about, remember that I took your body weight, and you did that within 1 to 3 hours before your training, you actually don't need to take a protein shake, right before your workout or right after. So if you had a meal, say 2 hours before your workout that had enough protein, then you don't have to take a protein shake before. So it becomes an option. To me, I tell people, yeah, I love to take a protein shake before I work out and then one after your workout. But if you're going to eat a meal 1 to 2 hours before your workout, then you don't need to take that protein shake before you work out. So as long as you're getting that consistent feeding of protein and you take something within the 1 to 2, maybe even up to 3 hours before your workout, that's going to be great. And then, of course, it's not going to hurt you to take the protein shake afterwards. So you taking protein before and after workout is only going to have upside with no downside. That's why I recommend it. All right. Also says for athletes, this would be a little higher. Would they just supplement the diet with post-exercise? But yeah, athletes, you want to make sure you get the number. That recommendation is per feeding, all right? And it's pretty consistent across the board. Athletes, Austin, to your question, would just have to do that more frequently, like you're saying. They would just have to complement or strategize to do multiple feedings through the day to get to their number. All right. A few more slides here. So another one has also been, what can I take during an exercise? I saw one of the text messages talking about, I think it was Eduardo said that we could have this during the workout. Sure, you could. Remember, the most important thing in a workout is to hydrate. Fluid is the most important thing to have. So if you were drinking one of these types of products, as long as it didn't compromise the amount of fluid you'd normally be eating, then yeah, it's not going to hurt. Because the question is there any value to taking protein during a workout? Well, there is a prevailing theory. This has more application to the endurance athlete, but then I'll talk about resistance training too. So there's this prevailing theory called the central theory of fatigue. The idea is that if I'm out there training for 2 hours, 3 hours, like an endurance athlete, what is it that makes me get tired? Why do I suddenly start to feel like I'm fatiguing and I'm tired at the end of the workout? Is it running out of energy? Well, they've done studies to find that people are feeling fatigued, but they haven't necessarily depleted their glycogen stores. So why are they feeling fatigued? Well, the one theory comes down to this idea of amino acids getting into the brain. And that's what this theory is about. Remember, it's a theory. A theory does not absolutely explain concepts. It provides a reasonable explanation. And the idea is this. We, in the waking hours of your day, like to keep balanced ratios of amino acids in your blood. Some amino acids like BCAAs are taken up more into the muscle cells. They don't really go into the brain. But we always want to keep a balanced ratio because amino acids will cross into the brain. And the problem is if too much amino acids cross into the brain, or if one particular amino acid crosses into the brain in excessive quantities, it can create a consequence. Every neurotransmitter in your brain is produced from an amino acid. So we talk about glutamine, tyrosine, tryptophan. We've got Thanksgiving coming around the corner, so we talk about tryptophan. What do we know about tryptophan? People say, I take tryptophan, I feel sleepy. Why? Well, because tryptophan is involved in the production of serotonin, which is a calming neurotransmitter, and that actually can facilitate the production of from 5-hydroxytryptophan into melatonin, which is a hormone that helps induce sleep. Right? So what happens during the day is if I don't want too much tryptophan to get into my brain because it makes me sleepy, we can actually bind some of that tryptophan to a big protein carrier in the blood called albumin. And if that tryptophan is bound to albumin, then it can't cross the blood-brain barrier, which means the capillary network that allows things to get into the brain. It can't penetrate the brain because it's being held on this big protein carrier. That's too big to go into the brain. But now you start exercising. And think about what you do during exercise is you mobilize your fats. So now you're mobilizing your fats, and what's happening is your fats have to be transported to the muscle cells, but they're getting transported in the blood. And blood doesn't like water. Sorry, no, blood is water, sorry. Fats don't like water, I'm sorry. Fats don't like water. So how on earth do we put fats into our blood and get it over to the muscle cells? Well, we physically bind the fats to a protein carrier. Happens to be the same protein carrier that we're talking about. Albumin. But albumin can't carry both. So what albumin has to do is says, listen, I need to discard some of this tryptophan so it becomes unbound, so to speak, so in favor of carrying these fats. Well, now you've got more tryptophan floating around the blood, and theoretically more can get into your brain, which can then trigger that sensation of fatigue. So this is the central theory of fatigue. So based on that, some researchers said, well, what if we supplement during the workout with some protein? And what they did is they just started using BCAAs. Figure, we know during exercise, the digestive system is shut down. So let's not worry about digestion. Let's just give intact BCAAs because those will just go straight into the blood. So that's the only downside of this during your workout is your digestive process in the workout is kind of shut down. So amino acids, BCAAs, things like that might be a slightly better choice than an intact protein during the workout. It's because for those of you that are in exercise physiology with me, we talked about how the digestive system shuts down during a workout. But if you've got amino acids, they don't have to be digested. They just pass right through, right? So they said, let's give these athletes a supplement. So you can see some dosages I'm giving you right there. They were using beverages that had a 1 to 2% concentration. So how do you figure that out? Read your labels. I'll give you an example. If you got 5 grams of protein in an 8-ounce serving, 8-ounce serving is going to be 240 mils or whatever the serving is. Just divide one into the other. So 5 divided by 240. Express that as percentage, so that's 2.1%. So in these studies, they were using a 1 to 2% solution, which is what they recommend. And with endurance athletes, they found what? It actually reduced their perception of fatigue. Maybe having more BCAAs in the blood was competing with the tryptophan, so less was getting into the brain. That's kind of the idea right there. So they saw lower perceived exertion efforts, lower mental fatigue. Didn't see any necessarily physical performance. So for endurance athletes, we always tell them, if you're out there for over 2 hours, you might want to consider drinking some BCAAs because it might help reduce the perception of fatigue in your workout. All right, well, that's not enough. People say, what about resistance training? Does it help with resistance training? Well, from a psychological performance, they didn't see any difference. But they started looking at, what about the workout itself, physical performance? They didn't find necessarily any improvement in the workout, but what they did find is that, remember, exercise is catabolic in nature. And so your body's going to probably attack muscle protein because of elevations of things like cortisol. But when they were supplementing with BCAAs, what they were finding is that the cortisol was in fact attacking food protein as opposed to muscle protein. So they were finding less muscle soreness. People were experiencing less muscle soreness, right? And therefore they were recovering faster from their between workouts. And if you think about that, in turn, indirectly, that could ultimately improve your performance because you could be returning to your next training session a little sooner, which means you get more training under your belt. It might improve performance. So we can kind of say it has a little bit of an indirect enhancement or benefit to physical performance. So taking some BCAAs, if you want, you can see some dosages that I'm giving you right there. But here's the one caveat. Make sure that if you are choosing to drink a product that has some BCAAs in it, that it is not compromising your overall intake of fluid, because the overall intake of fluid is the most important thing. All right, and last but not least, what do we do after exercise? Well, as I said, we've seen these studies looking at, does some protein help the body recover? Well, interesting, with endurance athletes, they found that in the first hour, a little bit of protein with the carbohydrates, because remember, endurance athletes are trying to recover their carbs, their glycogen. They found that a little bit of protein given in the first hour with some carbohydrates actually accelerated glycogen replenishment. It seems to have an added effect on insulin's ability to push glucose into the cells. So for an endurance athlete, they like a little bit of protein in the first hour because it helps not just with a little bit of muscle recovery, but it also helps with glycogen replenishment. Right? So think of people that have to do training on a daily basis. I think of like the Tour de France, the Giro d'Italia, those types of events where they're training pretty vigorously, on a regular basis, or competing very vigorously on a regular basis. But when it came to this, what about people that are taking their protein shakes after the workouts? Does it really have a big impact? Well, with the average person, they found no, if they were eating multiple protein feedings through the day. In other words, if this was like just like another meal, no. So people that were taking the protein shake after the workout versus people that were eating periodically through the day, they didn't find much of a difference. So they did a meta-analysis. So Brad Schoenfeld and Alan Aragon did a meta-analysis, a review of all the literature, and they said they didn't see any difference. As long as you're feeding frequently through the day, that post-exercise protein feeding doesn't seem to make a difference. However, if it is adding to the protein, in other words, this is an extra feeding that's giving you the protein that you need, then of course it's going to make a difference. So that was their only caveat. If this is just now going to be kind of an additional meal that's going to get your numbers to where they need to be, then of course it's going to help you. But if it's that versus you just having 4 meals through the day or multiple meals through the day, it's not going to make a difference. But for resistance trained athletes, they did find. They found that in resistance trained athletes, goes back to what Austin was asking me, who need more protein in their diet, generally this post-exercise protein shake is going to do what? It can further elevate rates of muscle protein synthesis. So the way I look at it, it's never going to hurt you, right? Chances are this is going to do more benefit than harm. So I'm always an advocate of a protein shake after your workout. But I'm also an advocate of a protein shake before your workout, or a meal 1 to 2 hours, maybe up to 3 hours before your workout, one of those two options. So I'm definitely a big fan of bookending your workouts with good sources of protein on both sides. So it brings us to the last slide here. All right. What do we know about protein synthesis rates? Well, post-exercise, it's when it's most active for about the first 6 hours. So there should be some feeding during that time. And the sooner you can get it in, probably the better, because there's time needed to digest and absorb it, because not all of you are going to just be taking a whey protein powder, which, as I said, could be in your blood in 15 to 20 minutes. You might be taking a meal, Problem with a meal is that there's other things in there like fiber and fats, going back to what Taylor asked me. And that could slow down the delivery of protein. Don't waste time. Get protein into your body as quickly as possible. So get hydrated and get protein into your body as quickly as possible. But really, there should be, when you're thinking about multiple feedings through the day, there should be consideration of these 6 periods through the day. Overcoming your morning, your overnight fast, that pre-workout time that I kind of told you, something during the workout, if it's something that works for you, like the BCAAs, the post-workout, all right, 3 to 4 hours, all right, post-exercise. So remember we talked about how, 7 hours later, the casein was showing sustained levels of muscle protein synthesis. And then the one thing that a lot of people are doing right now is taking some protein before they go to bed. I'm giving you some examples of numbers there. Those aren't the numbers. Remember I said your feeding should be at least 0.18 grams of protein per meal. But if you're going to do more feedings through the day, then you might say, well, I can break that protein down into slightly smaller levels. Just don't make it too small. So really stay in that range of about 15 to 25 grams. So I'd say 15 to 20 for the girls and maybe 20 to 25 for the grams for the men. But if you're going to do multiple feedings, then you can kind of look at some of these numbers I'm giving you right there. So the way you should do this is really take a step back and say, all right, how much protein do I need for the day? So let's say your number was 140 grams. You say, all right, let's work backwards. I am going to eat breakfast. Part of breakfast is just to overcome the overnight fast. So a little bit of carbs, a little bit of protein is a way to kind of help you get out of that overnight fast, because that little bit of protein can help spare some muscle protein when cortisol levels are still high. So maybe I'm going to take about 10 grams in the morning. So I'm going to have an egg and a piece of toast, whatever it is. Okay. I'm not going to eat a meal before I work out. So I'm going to take a protein shake before I go work out. All right, at least try and get, in that range of, 15 to 25 grams in there, or, at least try and get, I say 0.1 to 0.14 of a fast protein. That would be a whey. But if it was something not a whey, you might want to go a little higher. So maybe just stick with that 0.18 and you get that in your pre-workout. Now you're thinking, okay, I'm in the workout. Go back to the slide on the workout. Maybe I want some BCAAs during the workout. The research showed somewhere between 7 and 25 grams per hour. Maybe you want to go a little bit, start with a low level. Maybe you want to go a little higher level, depending on what works for you. Then after my workout, I definitely want to take a protein shake. Again, take your level there, think about something several hours later, and then think about something before you go to bed. Now, I'm putting a small dose on there. I'm saying greater than 10 to 15 grams, because some of the research now is talking about 40 to 50 grams of a slow protein before you go to bed. I don't like that. That's a lot of food to be putting in your stomach when you're trying to go to bed. Think about it. One of my favorite late night snacks, a quintessential slow protein, is cottage cheese. You can buy low fat, non-fat cottage cheese. So it's not high in calories. And a 4-ounce serving, a little container, they sell them in little containers at the grocery store, has about 9 grams of protein. All right, so let's say you want me to get 45 grams. All right, I need 5 of these because they have 9 grams. You want 45 grams, I'm gonna have to eat 5 of them. That means I'm gonna need 20 ounces of cottage cheese. Do you know how much cheese that is? How much cottage cheese it is? That's a crap load to eat. And tell me, your stomach is gonna feel distended because your stomach empty is about 5 ounces. Your stomach distended is starting to reach about 20 ounces. Who wants to go to bed with a full tummy? So even though some researchers are talking about that, I think the research, because I looked at one study and they were using big male bodybuilders. All right, fine. A big male bodybuilder, I think they could handle that large quantity because they're a big person. But for the average person like you and I think that's just a huge amount. So I would say aim for at least 10 to 15 grams, maybe up to 20 grams, but try and make it a slow protein. These don't have to be powders. These can be foods, but just know that the slowest food out there is casein based, so cottage cheese. And the fastest protein out there when you need fast protein is going to be a whey isolate. Fortunately, there's no food that rivals that. That's a protein powder. All right. So Eduardo's saying Greek yogurt is my go-to before bed. Good tryptophan source. It does have some tryptophan, but Greek yogurt has a lot of whey in it, not as much casein. All right. So again, it's better than nothing, but you might want to think about, maybe, if you wanted, you could even sprinkle some casein powder in there and just stir it up if you wanted to. But I would certainly say that Greek yogurt is a good source of protein. It's certainly better than nothing. All right. All right. So that really ends our presentation. All right. Hopefully what I've shared with you is some information on protein supplementation. Those of you who are in 3 or 4, you'll probably see more of this again towards the end of the semester, right? For those of you who have taken 3 or 4, I know like Jessica and there's a few people in the class, maybe this was a good refresher for you. But more importantly, hopefully you now have some information you can take with you and apply them into your own practices. All right, with that, I'm going to stop the recording, but I'm going to let you ask any questions if you do have any.